Great. Welcome to the Democratic Business Council of Northern Virginia. We are going to be starting in 1 minute as we allow participants to start filling in. Great. We're going to go ahead and get started as participants are entering the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Democratic Business Council of Northern Virginia breakfast series that we are now doing via Zoom. And please continue to follow DemBiz online at dembiz.org for future events, and also on Twitter at DemBizNova. A special thank you this morning to Chris King and Carlos Del Toro for being the benefactors of our program this morning, as we are honored to have with us this morning Congressman Bobby Scott. And I'm going to take a moment to read his short bio, because as we are in the middle of chaos, it is so refreshing and honoring for us to have a member who represents us with such an incredible, rich level of experience. So Congressman Bobby Scott has represented Virginia's 3rd Congressional District and the House of Representatives since 1993. Prior to his service in Congress, he served 15 years in Virginia's General Assembly. Congressman Scott currently serves as chairman of the Committee on Education and Labor. In this capacity, he is advancing an agenda that improves equity in education, frees students from the burdens of crippling debt, protects and expands access to affordable health care, ensures workers have a safe workplace where they can earn a living wage free from discrimination, and guarantees seniors have a secure and dignified retirement. In 2015, he was one of the 4 primary authors of the Every Student Succeeds Act, which reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act for the first time in 13 years, replacing the No Child Left Behind Act. Congressman Scott also serves on the Committee on the Budget, where he is a leading voice on fiscal policy and reducing the deficit. As a former member of the Committee on the Judiciary, he is a leading advocate for reforming our nation's broken criminal justice system. He has successfully worked to pass bipartisanship to reduce mandatory minimum sentences, reform the juvenile justice system, and require reporting and federal data collection of deaths that occur in police custody, jails, and prisons. Congressman Scott resides in Newport News, Virginia. He is a graduate of Harvard College and Boston College Law School. He also served in the Massachusetts National Guard and the United States Army Reserve. Congressman Scott, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you, Lindsay. It's a pleasure to be with you. And when you said you're going to go through and tell the truth, I worked very closely with your former boss, Chet Edwards, and I thought you were going to tell all the truth. I'm glad you stuck to the script.
Yes, sir, I know better. Well, it is such a chaotic time, like we were talking just a few minutes ago, and it seems like every time we turn on the news, it even gets more bizarre. We are less than 30 days away from Election Day. Can you just lay out the groundwork for us at what's at stake in November?
Well, thank you, Lindsay. It's a pleasure to be here. There's so many things at stake and so many things going on all at once. So many crises, one crisis right after the other, that it's hard to keep up. But I think one of the most important issues has been created by the appointment to the Supreme Court. You remember in 2016, Republicans made a sanctimonious production out of the principle of never filling a vacancy at the Supreme Court during an election year. There were 10 months left, at least 10 months left in President Obama's term, and they stonewalled that nomination for the entire remainder of his term. And then come back in 2020, 4 years later, not 10 months, but about 4 weeks before the election, and here they are filling the vacancy. That was, I think the Democrats are making a mistake trying to argue whether or not it should be filled, kind of esoterically in terms of the policy. The real crime in this is the fact that Republicans don't keep their word. They said they'd never do this, and now they're doing it. Fundamental fairness. If you didn't fill it 4 years ago, if you ask a fourth grader what you should do this time, they wouldn't say, well, if you got the votes, you ought to go ahead and fill it. No, they'd say you shouldn't fill it now. I mean, they understand fundamental fairness, and just the jaw-dropping hypocrisy of it all just shows what we're dealing with. But the important thing about the vacancy is that people talk a lot about Roe v. Wade, and I'm convinced that the Republicans want the issue, not the policy, because if they ever got the policy, it would, 2/3 of America is pro-choice, and they don't care because the court's protecting that issue. The 1/3 that for whom it's an important issue, when I tell a group I'm pro-choice, I'm not talking to 1/3 of the audience anymore. I would like my opponent to say he's right to life and not be talking to 2/3 of the audience. The important thing is not just Roe v. Wade, but healthcare. Amy Coney Bryant is on record as criticizing Chief Justice Roberts for voting to sustain the Affordable Care Act. And so the reason they need her on the court is to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. And you know, when you talk about it, you got to go back before the Affordable Care Act to really appreciate it. Costs were going through the roof. Millions of people every year were losing their insurance. Those with pre-existing conditions couldn't get insurance, or if they could, they had to pay extraordinary amounts of money. $1,000 out of your premium for a family policy was going to cost shifting because so many people didn't have insurance, got sick, went to the hospital, didn't pay. When people with insurance went to the hospital, they'd have to pay a little extra. That amounted to about $1,000 on a family policy. After the Affordable Care Act passed, costs got under control, still going up, but at the lowest rate in recent history, particularly for those on the exchange, because they're locked in to a percentage of income. Instead of millions of people losing their insurance, 15 million people gained insurance. Those with pre-existing conditions didn't have to pay more than anybody else. They just signed up, no questions asked. And pre-existing conditions included women who pay more than men, no longer. And to give you, we didn't solve all the problems. We solved a lot of them. And to show what a good job we did, after 10 years of whining, when President Trump came in with the Republican House and Senate, they had to put up a plan. They'd been whining, they put up a plan. CBO scored the plan that passed the House. 20% increase in cost the first year. 20-some million fewer people insured. Those with pre-existing conditions will start losing their protection, and because they don't have an essential benefits, the insurance you get will be worse than what you already have. They passed it, and but for John McCain, thumbs down, saving it, that would have become the law. But that's at stake now, because if it's ruled unconstitutional, then it's all messed up. The whole thing can go, or parts of it can go. And that goes back to the importance of this election, because if they mess it up, if we have the president, the Senate, and the House, we can fix it. Of course, they need this nominee on the court now because they have a case right after the election, the week after the election, to deal with the Affordable Care Act. They want her seated so she can rule it unconstitutional. But whatever they do to it, we can fix it if we have the president, the Senate, and the House. And that's why this election is so important. They don't have time to come to give the people relief for a COVID relief package. They don't have time for that. But they do have time to put this nominee on the court to kill healthcare, and that's why healthcare is on the ballot. The recovery is at stake. We have Heroes 2, we had Heroes 1, they ignored for several months, did nothing. They pressed the pause button, as they say. And they finally came up with a little emaciated, skinny bill. We call it emaciated bill, brought it up and couldn't even pass it. The Senate hadn't really done anything. The recovery is at risk. Chairman Powell of the Fed said the risk of doing too little is a lot more than the risk of doing too much, because the first CARES Act, second CARES Act, and other legislation really kept the economy afloat. It's running out. We need to replace it. This administration has no idea what to do with the economy. All they've done is taken credit for Obama's economy. They prance around like peacocks, like they've done something when they haven't. Let me do a little what I call low-tech screen sharing. This is a chart of the unemployment rate. That hump right in the middle is what Obama inherited. His policy went into effect right past the top of the hump, right at the top of the hump, and you can see that his policy had a downward effect on the unemployment rate. Unemployment rate went down, 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 down. Trump's economic plan cost twice as much, and show me a wrinkle in the trend. He's prancing around like he did something. His plan did nothing other than you see the explosion at the end when he mismanaged the pandemic and the unemployment rate went through the roof. But not a wrinkle in the plan. They don't know what to do other than take advantage of, take credit for Obama's plan, accuse him of leaving an economy in disarray. You saw the unemployment rate. They did nothing, and other than have record unemployment insurance to the point where these 800,000 a month, we've just gotten used to it. They say it's down, it's better than last month. The previous record for initial claims for unemployment compensation, the world record in the United States for initial claims was 600 and some thousand. Since the unemployment compensation started, 600 and some thousand. They've done over 800,000 for over 20 consecutive weeks. They haven't been able to get control of the economy. And now the Fed, Chairman Powell is telling them what to do, and they don't know what to do. So our recovery is at stake if we don't do something in relief, and if we don't crush the virus. As long as the virus is out there, we're gonna have problems. Obviously, they have no clue, no plan to deal with the virus other than pat themselves on the back and say what a good job they're doing. So the recovery is at stake in this election. Meanwhile, we're still getting work done. I chair the Education and Labor Committee, as you mentioned. K through 12 education is important if we're going to have a well-educated, well-trained workforce to attract businesses. You have to start early childhood education, then K through 12. We're dealing with the achievement gaps, which are even more pronounced under this distance learning. We're dealing with segregated schools. A GAO report a couple of years ago, about 2 years ago, reported that the schools today are as segregated as they were in the 1960s. And we've passed legislation in the House to do something about it. We'll see what the Senate does. But if high school diploma isn't enough, we have to have skills and training past the high school level. That means you have to have college has to be affordable. It is not right now not affordable. Too many of our young people are deciding they can't afford to go to college. That is a tragedy in America, where people can't be all they can be, notwithstanding the fact that the Higher Education Act, when it passed, President Johnson said, and it was true, that any child can apply to any college in any state and not be turned away because the family is poor. and the Pell Grant was covering 85% of the cost. States were putting up 2/3 of the cost of state colleges. And so you could work your way through college 15 hours a week, almost minimum wage. Now, states are putting in about 1/3, and the Pell Grant covers only about 30%. The rest is student loans. If you're not willing to take out a mortgage-sized debt, you may not be able to go to college. We need to get back to where college is more affordable. But a lot of people aren't going for a 4-year liberal arts degree. They want skills training so they can get a good job. And so we have legislation pending. We just passed the House, the committee just reported an apprenticeship bill that will create 1 million apprenticeship possibilities so that people can get apprenticeships. The experience on the registered apprenticeship program is you come out with an average $70,000 salary, and we want to expand the kinds of things you can get apprenticeships for to include not just the building trades, but finance, healthcare, and a lot of other industries. We also, in the Higher Education Act, want to do what's called short-term Pell. Right now, you can only use the Pell Grant for courses that lead to a college degree. If it doesn't lead to a college degree, if all it leads to is a good job, you can't use a Pell Grant. Well, that's absurd. If it leads to a good job, you ought to be able to use the Pell Grant and get what we call stackable credentials. Nursing shows how this is. You can start off a CNA, a certified nurse assistant, and then a licensed an LPN, and then an RN, and then advanced practices. Each one stacks on the other. And those kind of credentials are the kinds of things that we ought to be able to help people get those kinds of credentials. The community colleges have these kind of courses. Some are 8 weeks, 16 weeks, where you can increase your income 25, 50, even 100%. But they cost a couple of $1,000s. And you've seen the reports. Most people can't come up with $400. Well, so if it's a couple of $1,000s, it might as well be $100,000. People can't afford it. They can use the Pell Grant. They can not only pay tuition, they can also get a little living expense so they can afford to go. So we need to make sure that the skills training are there. If you have a well-trained, well-educated workforce, you're more likely to attract good businesses. We need the jobs there. That's where the Moving Forward Act comes in. That includes infrastructure, traditionally roads and bridges, but also school construction and broadband. In the rural areas, if you don't have broadband, try to attract some businesses to come to your area. So all of that is going on now. We're also trying to help workers. We have a consumer-based economy, so the more money the workers have, the better off we are. So we're increasing the minimum wage. The PRO Act makes it easier to join unions. They do better in terms of salary, benefits, equal pay. And you don't want good businesses competing against people that are underpaying their workers and union busting. You want the good businesses to compete with people who have to play by the same rules. And finally, police reform. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act has passed the House. No chokeholds, no no-knock warrants, no racial profiling, establishes national standards on things like training for implicit bias and de-escalation and use of force, collects a lot of data, and holds police officers accountable, criminal and civil and criminal if necessary, on actions. There's nothing in that bill that's unreasonable. Most of it is present law, just codified and make sure it applies to police officers. And it's passed the House, and the Senate, again, isn't taking any action. But we need the police reform to address the ongoing protests that are all over the country. And I think people were just outraged with the George Floyd. I've heard reports, some theories that because people were at home and had to watch that over and over and over again, they just got to the point where they knew it was wrong, and something has to be done. I think the House bill is a major step in the right direction, and should pass. So with that, that's kind of what's going on, and I understand you have some questions, so let's get to the questions.
Well, thank you. I mean, what you just laid out, what's at stake in November even makes me more thankful that we have leaders and champions like you in Congress, because it is so important. And I know we've had quite a few people join us here in the last 5 to 10 minutes. Again, welcome to Democratic Business Council of Northern Virginia Breakfast Series. Please submit your questions for Congressman Scott to answer in the Q&A box, and we'll make sure and get to those. Congressman Scott, we've had quite a few questions already submitted, so we'll get right to those questions. The first question comes from one of your good friends and former colleagues, former Congressman Chet Edwards. He asks, you are the greatest single champion in the entire Congress for religious liberty and church-state separation. What do you believe are some of the most serious challenges to religious liberty we are facing today, either from Congress or the courts?
Well, I want to thank Chet for all the work that he did when he was a member of Congress. We spent a lot of lonely nights on the floor arguing about amendments to try to protect religious liberty. There is a interesting redefinition of the idea of what a victim of discrimination is. When in the 1960s, when you were doing the civil rights bills, you wanted to protect people who wanted to go into a restaurant and not be denied service because of race, religion, national origin. You wanted to protect that's the victim if they were denied service. If you apply for a job and are denied because of your membership in a protected class, you are the victim of discrimination. If you're trying to get benefits from an organization and you're denied, you're the victim of discrimination. At least that's how it used to be. Now, the victim of discrimination has been changed to the discriminator. If the employer can't discriminate against you, then he is the victim of his religious liberties are involved. If he can't deny you contraception under the Health Care Act, he is the victim, not you. He is the victim. I mean, if we had this in the 1960s, if someone owned a restaurant and somebody came in and he had to serve them, notwithstanding his religious beliefs, he is the victim, not the one trying to eat a meal. And you hear, one of the problems we had in this all along has been the unwillingness of anybody to acknowledge what was going on, that the discrimination was actually happening. I've got some clips of, and regrettably it's bipartisan, who don't know what I'm talking about when you say discrimination. We finally got an agency in South Carolina, a child placement agency, to acknowledge what was going on. They will not place children with anything other than good Christian families. Your other religions, you can go to other agencies. It sounds like, well, you can't eat here, but there's a restaurant across the street you can go to. But they will not serve you. And so the issue is joined. Are you entitled to services from a government-funded agency, notwithstanding your race or religion, or can the people who are running the agency discriminate against you because of your religion? That's right before us. Now, right now, they're keeping the money. But if you look at it from the point of view of the redefinition of who the victim is, you can see how bizarre this situation is. Chet and I and a few others argued this night and day, and we made a little progress, but not a whole lot. But now I think it's front and center. They can't get away from it. They usually argue it in terms of gay rights, whether or not somebody by virtue of religion has to serve or hire or otherwise equally treat those because of sexual orientation. Most states, sexual orientation is not a protected class, so you're free to do it. What they ignore is, suppose you're a white supremacist If you own a restaurant, do you have to serve black people? If you have strongly held beliefs, argument is still made. If you are one religion, why should you have to serve people of another religion? I tell people, well, I don't know, but we had that debate 50 years ago and our side won.
Right.
And if you want to relitigate it, then put it on top of the table and say you want to be able to discriminate against people because of race or religion, because you got strongly held beliefs, fine. But let's not cover it up like it's something noble. And this is just straight up discrimination. And Chet understands that well. It's the other side has been able to reframe the issue as if you're unable to discriminate, you are the victim. And I think we have to kind of reframe that back to the way it was. If you're the victim of discrimination and you're not getting the same services as somebody else, then you are the victim, and the weight of the government ought to be on your side, not on the side of the person discriminating against you.
Absolutely. We've had several questions come in, and I'm going to combine it into one because Louis and a few others, Joanna, all have asked this question in a different way, but the same question. It says, does Congressman Scott support HR 763, the energy innovation and carbon dividend legislation? And if not, why?
Well, there are a lot of, we have to do something to try to switch towards non-carbon related fuel sources. We have stuck our thumb on the scale in favor of oil with things like the oil depletion allowance and things like that, which makes it cheaper to buy oil. We need to, things like this legislation, put our thumb on the scale to encourage non-polluting non-polluting energy sources. And this is just one way. There are a lot of other possibilities. This is one, and it's a good one. And the committees are going to go through all of them and come up with a final product. But I think anything that gets us, uses the tax code, legislation, or anything else to encourage us into the non-polluting energy sources will be good. We have been successful so far in offshore. We're encouraging offshore wind, not offshore oil drilling, which off the coast of Virginia. And let me tell you, that was a battle. At one time, there were just a few of us fighting the offshore oil, but gradually, I think the consensus has been against offshore oil. I mean, I don't know why anybody would, you know, if you do offshore oil rigs, probably there won't be any oil spills, probably. But why are you taking that kind of risk? I think the real tipping point came when the businesses in Virginia Beach came out against the offshore drilling, because they recognized that, why are you taking a chance on destroying the beaches and destroying our businesses for a initiative that in fact will not reduce gas prices? The little bit of oil that is produced will not affect the global price of oil, and that's what people pay. And it's just too much of a risk. And I think when they came out, people took another look, and gradually, I think the consensus now is that we don't want the offshore drilling. But we need to look at all of the options. This is a good one, and we'll see what the committee comes up with in the final analysis. But I think that's a step in the right direction.
Thank you. Our next question comes from John. For years, the Republicans rallied against tax and spend and the deficits, but they seem to have adopted borrow and squander budget plan. How can we get to a better budget process?
Well, I think the Republicans are much better at rhetoric than we are. They talk about tax and spend, but at least the Democrats have the common decency to tax before we spend. They just spend. most Democrats oppose the Part D prescriptive drug benefit that all Democrats love, but it wasn't paid for. And so the question was, how do you like a drug benefit? Well, okay, how are you going to pay for it? Don't worry about it. When President, we talk about the big debt and deficit and all that. When President Clinton left office, after his budget, one of the first big votes I cast was on the in the 93 on the Clinton budget that didn't get a single Republican vote, that put us on a course towards when he left. We were on course by 2008 to pay off all of the government bonds, and by 2013 put all the money back in the trust funds. National debt paid off. The Republicans came in after the 2001, after the Supreme Court declared the 2000 election. They came up with two major tax cuts, for 2 wars, and a prescriptive drug benefit. Didn't bother to pay for any of them, and all of a sudden you're back in the ditch. And they're talking about fiscal responsibility. The fact is that every Democratic president since Kennedy, every administration, has left office with a better deficit situation than it came in with, without exception. Every Republican since that time has left with a worse deficit situation than they came in with. And President Trump was well on the way to maintaining that tradition before the pandemic. Of course, after the pandemic, he's just totally out of control. But notwithstanding that, they get credit for better economy, better stewardship of the budget. We're just not as good at messaging. Part of it is we're not as good at lying because we're constrained by the truth. They say whatever they want. I've been on the floor listening to Republicans talk about the insanity of deficits, why it is so immoral to leave this kind of debt to the next generation. And then they vote for an unpaid for tax cut. I don't know many Democrats that could deliver that kind of speech, but they get away with it. Anyway, we can do better. We have a plan. We'll go back to fiscal responsibility. They use, every time we do something right, like get the budget under control, they come up and use those votes against us. After the 93 budget, they used the votes, and when Marjorie Magoulas-Brzezinski cast the 218th vote in favor of that bill, the Republicans didn't say, "Way to go, Marjorie, we've got a budget that's going to get us under control." No, they were chanting, "Bye-bye, Marjorie," and she was gone in the next election. That's what happens. And then they try to take credit for the bipartisan, about halfway through the process, they had a bipartisan budget. When that thing passed, there was a question of whether the budget had already balanced itself. They hadn't finished counting the money when we voted, but it turns out there's a teeny bit of deficit, and that budget put us into surplus, and they're taking credit. The only thing they added to that budget was tax cuts. No tough spending cuts, no tough tax increases. They just got Clinton just gave them their tax cuts. And if you want to know what would happen when their budget came in, you just saw it in 2001 when Bush came in with massive tax cuts, unpaid for, didn't bother to pay for the war, didn't bother to pay for the prescription drug benefit, and all of a sudden we're back in the ditch big time. They're just better at the rhetoric. And if Democrats get control next time, we'll have the responsibility of doing the right thing and getting the budget back under control. Chairman Powell said that you cannot restrain yourself right now, because if you do not spend the money now, the recession will be so deep that the deficit will be worse if you don't spend enough now than if you do.
Absolutely. Our next question comes from RJ. Vice President Biden and Senator Harris have talked about making community college tuition free for all, regardless of income. Where do you stand on this, and how can we do it?
That was first proposed under President Obama. I introduced the bill to do that, so obviously I'm for it. People, you get free education through the 12th grade. For generations, that was about enough. Now it's not. To get the same level of education needed to participate in the economy, you really need to go into community college for skills training or towards liberal arts degree. One of the challenges is if you have free community college, you would adversely affect historically Black colleges and universities. So we had an exception. You could use your 2 years at an HBCU or a minority serving institution so that you didn't sabotage those schools. But it's a step in the right direction. The debate may take place as to whether or not free community college is a better use of the taxpayers' money other than using the same amount of money for Pell Grants. The disadvantage in Pell Grants is it's all federal. When you do community colleges, you can coerce the states into putting more money because you require a match. As I said, the states now, we used to pay 2/3 of the cost of state colleges. Now it's 1/3. To get them to inch up toward back up to the 2/3, we need a program with a match so that they will be contributing more towards the line item higher education. And the free community college is one way that we can do that.
Well, great. Question is from Michael Cook. What can we do to protect the polling places against potential attempts to disrupt the vote at the polls on election day? As someone who served on Protect the Vote in VA since Mark Warner established it after Bush v. Gore, we potentially see voter intimidation at the polls of the type that we have not seen in the past. My suggestion has been for the local party leaders to, in advance of the election day, be working with local and state law enforcement and our registrar's offices to be prepared to react if necessary on short notice that day. What are your thoughts on this?
I think that is probably the only strategy that we can actually use. There are certain assumptions you use in a democracy, and that is that you can go to the polls and vote. You have one party, the Republicans, who I think have concluded that if people have fair access to the ballot, they can't win. And so if you look at their election legislation, it's all designed to deny people, suppress the vote. They never deny the vote. Everybody can vote, but they put little speed bumps on the way so that although you can't identify which one it affects, a few people won't be able to get there. So you have shorter early vote, you have more restricted absentee voting, all these little things that they try, voter ID. You know, most people have an ID, but some don't. And for them, it's a hardship, but each individual, I mean, you can get there, but it's just an extra step. And out of every 1,000 people, a few won't be able to figure it out and get there. And that may be all they need to win a close election. And so all these little steps they put in the way are intended to suppress the vote. And that's why the voter intimidation, I mean, if they can't win with the legislation, maybe they can win by intimidation. As the story of one guy that drove up to the polls was met by his people on the other side, told, no, you can't vote today because this is, they look at him and say, you can't vote today because only Trump voters are voting today, and he drove away. You don't know whether he drove away because he believed it or because I don't want to get involved in this, I'll come back another time. And I'm sure he came back another time. But that's the kind of little mess that you can throw in. And a few people, you get, you know, that you can vote on Wednesday after the election. There's misinformation. It's the only way they can win. And so we have to put up with it. The intimidation, the laws are a little lax. You've got freedom of expression colliding with the with your right to vote. But I think the suggestion is you make sure that law enforcement is ready to respond on the spot when you identify problems. Now, most people, they're not gonna have a problem. But, you know, if you get a couple of precincts turning away a couple of people, elections have been extremely close. The 2000 election, couple of hundred votes was the entire national basis. You get Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, aggregate total was probably not much more than a couple of votes a precinct, if that much. You don't need to turn many people away to have the potential of changing the results. So I like the idea of working in advance with law enforcement so they know in advance. You get some of these open carry people who take advantage and prance around with their assault weapons. People just don't want to engage. And if that's the only way to the polls, you have a problem. I encourage people, and we've been encouraging people to vote early. Vote in person is the easiest way to do it. You go, you vote. I thought, you know, since it's technically absentee that you'd have to fill out all that form. They don't even make you fill out the form. You just go and vote to check off your name and vote just like you're in the precinct. If you do that early, you can avoid any of these situations. Or if you ask for a mail-in ballot, you can get your ballot. You can take it in and just drop it off. That's easy. Or you can mail it in. If you mail it in, make sure it's early so it gets there in time. There are a lot of different ways of voting, but make sure you get your plan and vote early, because that's one thing we do have control over. We can vote. And to the extent that this is not close, we have much more likelihood that they're not going to try to steal it.
Right, and as a follow-up to that question, I mean, as we get closer and closer to Election Day, I think people are going over, and we've seen the media go over different scenarios. One scenario is that Vice President Biden wins and Trump refuses to leave office. What happens then, Congressman?
Well, to a certain extent, it depends on the U.S. Senate. If we take over the Senate, there's no problem, he's gone. We have checks and balances, and we have a democracy. If he as an individual decides he's not going to go, and it's clear that he's lost, it doesn't matter what he thinks. The Secret Service will come and cart him out of the White House while the everybody else is at U.S. Capitol swearing in a new president. It doesn't matter. If he doesn't want to leave on his own, he'll be carted away. The problem occurs when he makes up some ruse and the U.S. Senate goes along with it so that the new Congress new House can't pass any legislation. That's what is concerning. And that is really concerning because of the speed at which the Republicans in the Senate went back on their word, said they'd never fill a vacancy in an election year. Here it is, 4 weeks before an election. Some people already started voting, and their word is no good. Their respect of fairness is no good, and their tolerance of jaw-dropping hypocrisy doesn't seem to faze them. And you couldn't name 10% of them that would last 24 hours before they were in line. You would have thought that, wait a minute, didn't we say we weren't going to do this? We can't do this. We said we would not. Our word is important. This would be hypocritical. You couldn't name 10% of them that would last 24 hours before they were right in line. You had two women who said, this isn't fair. We said we wouldn't do it, so we're not going to do it. Lindsey Graham, the clips on him going with great sanctimonious production saying, no, we'd never do it, hold me accountable. And really, that's what we ought to be focused on this. The fact that they're hypocrites, not fair, said they would not do it. That is what we ought to be focused on, not whether or not they didn't ask for the vacancy, and courts, the Supreme Court's, I mean, the Constitution says the vacancy, President, Senate, and regrettably, that's the argument we made 4 years ago. Do your job. So it just opens us up to hypocrisy. We got to just go to fairness. This is the way you did it last time. This is the way you do. Ask a fourth grader what you ought to do. But if he won't go and the Republicans in the Senate get behind him, it creates a very difficult situation. I don't think there's going to be a problem. I'm hoping that it won't be close. The American public will see what's going on. I think we're going to have the Senate, and that will eliminate any support he'd have in the legislative branch. I have no confidence in the Supreme Court. The fact that they could imply in 2000 that the reasoning that we use to give this decision to Bush shall not be used as precedence for the next case. I mean, almost unsaid, because next time we might need to be on the other side of the argument to make sure the one we want to win comes out ahead. I mean, to put that in the case is just gives you an idea of how far gone the Supreme Court is. But if we get the Senate and the House, he's gone. I don't care, and he'll be carted out unceremoniously, and that won't be a problem. If it's close, and if the senators are as unconcerned about traditions and principles as they are in the Supreme Court vacancy, we may have a problem. But of course, that's why it's so important for everybody to vote. When you have people that will violate these principles, when you have to answer questions like that, you know the democracy is at stake. What happens when a state sends in a list of electors other than the ones who are actually elected? I mean, when you have to answer questions like that, you have a problem with the democratic experiment. And so we have to make sure that people vote, and that we, I would hope that in states where the senator has just switched unceremoniously and is a total hypocrite, abusing power, that people notice and address that at the polls. And if they do, I think democracy would be okay.
That's great. We have two final questions as we finish up our session here this morning with Congressman Scott. First one is from Julie. It says, in addition to judges, the Trump administration is rushing to enact erroneous regulations as interim final rules that go into effect without effective notice or comment period. Many of these are coming from DHS, where the secretary and other leadership, including Ken Cuccinelli, have not been confirmed. Several of proposed regulations are anti-immigrant and will actually result in American jobs being offshored. Can you comment on what the Biden administration's first act might be to stay or reverse such regulations?
Well, yeah, he can stay and reverse those regulations. Another thing, if we have the U.S. Senate, we can use the Congressional Review Act like they did on several of President Obama's regulations in the last 6 months of the administration, and overturn them. So that both of those depend on the vote. You have to elect a president, and you have to elect a U.S. Senate, and increase the numbers in the House. If we do that, we'll be all right. We're within the last 6 months of the administration, so any regulations he promulgates will be vulnerable to a Congressional Review Act attack early in the administration. And I fully expect Congress, if we have a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate, to set aside a lot of these. You got a lot in immigration, you got a lot in the environment, you got a lot in education, all through the labor. You've got a lot of regulations that are being rushed through. Now, one of the problems they've had with regulations all the way through as they rush them through. And the Administrative Procedures Act requires you to take a deliberate approach, consider, have hearings and consider input as you make your regulations. You know, you're not bound by that input, but you have to show that you considered it. And they're skipping those steps and they're losing a lot of regulations because they're not doing it right. I suspect a lot of these rush through will be vulnerable to that attack. But the easiest thing to do is just win the Senate, win the White House, and then just reverse them all legislatively or administratively.
Thank you. Our final question is one that you touched on briefly in the beginning, but I think we can underscore the importance of it because we have seen a level of activism in our country since the death of George Floyd that has been unprecedented for many years. And it has continued well beyond even the House passing the most recent bill. What is it going to take to get the reform we actually really need in our criminal justice system?
Well, one of the criminal justice policy is easy. I've been at this for a long time. I was first elected to Congress in '92. I was in the state Senate serving on what we call the Courts of Justice Committee then, and found that if you just follow the evidence and research, you can do a good job on criminal justice reform. Or if you follow poll-tested slogans and sound bites, you can do a good job politically, but a miserable job in terms of good policy. The slogans and sound bites have gotten us nothing on crime reduction, but a lot in mass incarceration and discrimination. And so the effort has got to be to push evidence and research. Now, one of the things that's been helpful, it's slow but coming, is people have recognized how expensive mass incarceration is. We saw this a few years ago in Texas when their appropriations committee in the state legislature was told that we need $2 billion, this is one state, $2 billion in funding for prisons, for the corrections department to keep up with the growing prison population, $2 billion. Somebody suggested, you know, if you spend about 10% of that intelligently in prevention, early intervention, and rehabilitation, you might not have to spend all $2 billion. So they tried, and then they looked up and they had actually reduced crime so much that not only did they not have to build new prisons, they were able to close some they had. And that creates an interesting coalition because you have a humane criminal justice system and you saved a lot of money. I think as people look at the evidence and research, you can reduce crime and save money, or you can waste money, do nothing about crime, have mass incarceration and discrimination, and at some point can't afford it. It becomes obvious which direction you ought to go in. But you have to be dedicated towards following the evidence and research. Sometimes that's politically inconvenient, but if you stick to it, you can do a much better job. And I think we're slowly getting there because people are learning that you just can't afford the foolishness.
Absolutely. And you have just beautifully outlined for us throughout the hour of why it's so important right now to be engaged and to vote. And Congressman, as we end on this final note, I just would like to turn it over to you for the opportunity to really energize people right now and get people to the polls and make sure they get their friends and neighbors to the polls as well.
Well, I indicated that really democracy is at stake because if President Trump will not leave unless he's forced out. So we need to make sure that we have enough of a victory. But we're also at a disadvantage because when they start asking questions like, what happens if a legislature sends in a list of electors that actually weren't elected? What do we do? When you have to start answering questions like that, you know you have a problem with the democratic experiment because people aren't following traditions, precedents, doing the right thing, being fair. When you end up having to answer questions like that, people talk about filling this vacancy, And I'm surprised Chuck Schumer didn't ask Lamar Alexander for an apology when he said, of course, we're going to fill the vacancy. Democrats would have done it too. No, they wouldn't. I can't imagine, first of all, I can't imagine, and I vaguely remember people accusing Joe Biden of suggesting that not filling a vacancy in an election year. What happened? Well, he couldn't get the votes because it was so slimy that he couldn't get a unanimous Democratic vote. When he talked about court packing, FDR tried to pack the court. A Democratic Congress wouldn't go along with it. I mean, there's some things that you have statesmen in the Democratic Party that you can't get a unanimous Democratic Party to stonewall for 10 months, a Supreme Court nominee. And even if you did, the idea that 4 years later you could come back around and say, never mind, we're not going to keep our word. We know it's fair, but we're not going to do it. And we don't mind being hypocrites, unapologetic hypocrites, and let's all get together and vote for it. Can you imagine Dick Durbin as the Democratic whip saying we're going to get the votes to be a bunch of hypocrites? People look at him and say, Dick, are you kidding me? We can't do that. And so we need to make sure that we have a statesman being elected all over the country, that we don't have to answer questions as bizarre as what happens in this situation, that situation, because we're going to be fair, we're going to be reasonable. So democracy is really at stake. We need to make sure that people vote. The one thing we have control over is a vote. To the extent that we can vote, make sure we're in Virginia, that it's not close. We report early and it'll set the tone for America when they know that this is going to be a landslide. We need to make sure we send that message early so that those that are thinking of trying to steal the election just give up because it's not close enough. It's not within stealing distance. We can do this, and America will be much better off. We'll get health care, we'll get education, we'll create jobs, we'll have fiscal responsibility for real, not just in rhetoric. It all depends on what happens in this election. And so, Lindsay, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you. And we look forward to a great celebration on November 3rd. Vote early, vote.
Absolutely. Well, on behalf of Democratic Business Council of Northern Virginia, we want to thank Congressman Bobby Scott for joining us. Thank you all of the attendees for your time this morning as well. Congressman, it is an honor to have you. Thank you for your leadership, and thank you for fighting every single day on our behalf. We're very grateful to you.
Thank you.
Thank you again for joining us. Hope you have a good rest of the day. Goodbye.